Hello everyone, happy Dickens December. I hope you're having a great time reading some fabulous Christmas and ghost stories. I'm going to contribute a little bit to your fun, I hope. I want to say thank you to Christy, Laura, and Jess for letting me this space to talk to you a little bit about ghost stories and about Elizabeth Gaskell's contribution to household words. This beautiful, beautiful ghost story called The Old Nurse's Story was published in Dickens's journal Household Words in 1852 in what I've read was the first Christmas numbers. So it's such an inauguration to the Christmas numbers that Dickens produced. He produced so many of them, which in its own right is a contribution to that midwinter tradition of telling ghost stories during this lovely season of snow and wind and being with your family, staying cozy and sharing things around the fire or just with your family around the Christmas table. And I think, about around the dinner table, I should say. I want to talk about the story and I wanted to give like a heads up that I will talk about the whole thing. So if you are really wanted to just jump in and enjoy by yourself without spoilers, then just go ahead and then come back. And also, the story deals with some very sensitive issues about children. One of the ghosts is a child, so it deals with that. So if that's something that's very sensitive to you, then don't listen to me. Just Merry Christmas and just I'll see you later. So I'll jump right in. Like I said, this was a contribution, this holiday tradition or Christmas tradition of telling ghost stories, which is a continuation of a midwinter tradition from the people in the country and the people in like small communities that would gather around a fire to tell ghost stories. And I feel like they were perfect for this season. There's so many reasons. There's so many festivals like Saturnalia and things like that that you should explore. Definitely, you should read about it. One of my favorite reasons for this is that a lot of people didn't know how long winter was going to be, and you didn't know exactly if this was going to be a kind winter, if this was going to be a really horrible winter. And so this was a way to gather and kind of offer support, but also a way of exploring those really scary things. The fact that we didn't know if this winter was going to be like a great winter, if it's going to be a very scary winter, if it's going to be really long or if it's not. And it relates to death and ghosts because it is a perpetuation of the past, but also ghosts are a way of dealing with the end of something, but they're also the beginning of something. Because only through acknowledging this past, acknowledging this, or bearing the storm, we can get to the other side, right? So only through this, let's hold on. Let's hold on a little longer. Let's get together, stay warm, and remember that back then it wasn't, like you had this provisions, you couldn't travel as often, so you only had whatever you've collected during harvest season to survive the winter. So you didn't know if that was going to be enough. And those were scary times for people who didn't know if they were actually going to make it till next year. And that's what actually leads us to talking about ghosts and the afterlife and what comes next, what could experience in this other world, and also a way for talking to our ancestors and connecting with the people who are across the veil. The Old Nurse's Story talks about a little orphan named Rosamond who has lost both her parents very quickly, one after the other. She loses her father through a fever and her mother in childbirth, and unfortunately she also loses her little sibling. The story is told from the perspective of Hester, who is the nurse, who is hired as a very young woman, actually as a child, because if you think about Hester, when she's hired is before Rosamond's birth, and then she's 18 when she goes to Furnival Hall. So Hester is hired basically when she's maybe 13 or 12 to assist Rosamond's mother in childbirth and in caring for the children. And she becomes Rosamond's sole caretaker and companion as Rosamond now becomes an orphan and goes to live with her mother's family. She was also writing Cranford, which I think is very significant because Cranford is a story about the relationship between women, which I think it's a very heavy theme in the Old Nurse's story. We have the relationship between obviously Hester and Rosamond, a relationship that we know is still there today because Hester is telling the story to Rosamond's children. So the beginning is the end of the story, right? The beginning is this very cozy setting, probably Rosamond's children. It's Christmas, or they're around the fire, Christmas Eve or something like that, and you can imagine them just very eager to being told this story that their mother lived through, even if it is a very sad story. So Hester takes us with Rosamond to Furnival Manor, which is the house of Rosamond's mother's family. And in it, we are introduced to Grace, who is the Miss Furnival in the house, and who's a lady, old lady. And we also have Miss Stark, who is Grace's companion. And there's something here also in the whole story about social class and the difference between social classes and how that's important to the story. Even, the servants have this sort of hierarchy. For example, Dorothy's husband, Dorothy being one of the servants in the house, he thinks he's better than his wife because he's worked at Furnival Manor for so long. And then even Hester herself is like, oh, I'm obviously in this upper place because Bessie the cook and all of these other undermaids are under me. And so there's this social class distinction. But the most important part is that Rosamond's father belongs to sort of like a merchant class, and when he married Rosamond's mother, it's like Rosamond's mother kind of went down in the social pyramid. And so when she gets in there, Grace or Miss Furnival makes a comment. It's like, oh, Rosamond loves to hang out with the servants, probably because of her father's blood. And that comment, I think it's important because it might signal to us that Miss Furnival actually hasn't grown so much from the events of her past. Inside Furnival Manor, there is this huge centerpiece, which is the organ that belonged to Mr. Furnival or Lord Furnival. That is kind of like the scene of all the horrible things that happened. And one night, Hester listens to this otherworldly music played by the organ. One of the maids tells her, like, yeah, this is something that happens all the time when winter is coming. And you get that this is like a recurrent sort of scene that plays out. This leads us to Hester and Rosamond being haunted by a woman and a little child. And Rosamond specifically, one day she's alone when Hester goes to church and she's left unprotected and is being haunted by a little girl, a little ghost that shows up and takes her to the cold embrace of a motherly ghost that lets her fall asleep in the snow. And this is when all things go down south. I hope you read it and you experience that as one of, I think it's so lovely. It's so short, and what Gaskell was able to do with such a little tale, and you can read it like really fast, and it's so enjoyable. I love it. Like I said, it's like the perfect ghost story. I want to say two things that again allude to the ending. So once again, if you don't like spoilers, one thing that I, for example, took so much was when Rosamond was saying, "My little girl, my little girl." The first time I read it, I used to think that maybe Maud or the motherly ghost, who we find out is Grace's older sister, and that both sisters were fighting for the love of this musician who would be considered below their station. So now you have the themes of the female relationships or relationships between women, and you have the theme of the social classes in there, because both women were fighting for a man who was below their social status. And eventually the musician marries Maud in like a secret wedding, and they have a secret daughter, and this is the ghostly appearance that shows up. And in the end, Gaskell does something truly fantastic, which is that she lets everybody see this ghostly scene replay, right? And you have many themes in that scene. You have this sort of mark of Cain or mark of sin that the little girl carries from her grandfather that strikes her. You have the mother kind of Madonna figure of like Maud in the snow, cuddling her child. And this is also important because at the beginning of the tale, like I said, I thought that maybe Rosamund was being haunted or possessed by Maud because she kept saying, my little girl, my little girl. But then at the beginning of the story in this reread, I caught the whole Rosamund's mother just passing away. And the fact that she passed away during childbirth and that Rosamund not only lost a mother, but she also lost a little sibling. And the symbolic resemblance of how the little ghost is always told to be younger than Rosamund, smaller than Rosamund, kind of like an emphasis on like she's smaller, like a little sister would have been, right? And so one of the key elements that you have to think when you're reading a ghost story is that relationship between the ghost and its witness. So a ghost can show itself to one person in particular, so the whole other cast of characters can be like, well, this person is insane. Or a ghost can be very ambiguous, so some characters can say, oh yeah, I hear it, or I smell it, but I don't see anything. But also you have characters who are exposed to the ghost, and sometimes ghosts just show themselves to everybody, like in the case of this story. So that it gives it validity to the ghost appearance. But also the ghost is choosing Rosamund for a particular reason. And Rosamund has gone through this traumatic event of losing both parents. And she sees perhaps a ghostly return of her own mother and the little baby that could represent her sister. And she sees my little girl, because it might activate or it might allude to her own sisterly, protection of being like, hey, I need to save my little sister. She's out there in the snow. She sees it in this way because remember, Rosamund is about 5 years old, and it's a way of her dealing with her own trauma and dealing with the things that she just experienced. That relationship between the ghost and the character who's haunted. And I think Rosamund and Grace are the most haunted characters, but Grace, obviously, she hasn't let go of the events of the past, which is something that we can see through her own comments and through the repetition of this in the house, in the home, and the fact that she doesn't leave it, she doesn't move from it. She stays haunted by this presence because she thinks it is her redemption, or not just her redemption, but it is her punishment for what she did, right? So I think she's voluntarily staying imprisoned in Furnival Manor in order to, relive all of these events as a way of punishing herself for what she did. And in the case of Rosamund, she breaks out of that cycle because at the end, the end is very sudden, but the beginning is the end of the story. We know that Rosamund was able to have children and to live a good life. And I want to leave you with a little something. In the Victorian period, a lot of I would say about 60% of the people who wrote short stories, ghost stories, were women. And that leads me to something that Gaskell talked about really a lot in her stories, was about how storytelling empowers women. It is a way of preserving the past. It is a way for educating the future, and it is also a way for women to explore things that perhaps a society that limited them didn't allow them to explore so fully. So it was a space for women to think about other issues, to kind of, push the boundaries a little bit. You see this with Frankenstein and how Mary Shelley had so much trouble with her story, right? Because it was like something that women were not supposed to write about. And Gaskell herself was a very respectable woman who was the wife of a minister. And so these stories are a little bit like dangerous territory for her. It allows her to be judged, but she still has her career as a very provincial author like George Eliot and Thomas Hardy, because she wrote North and South, Mary Barton, and she's writing Cranford. She has this reputation, but she's able to explore all of these maybe salacious and other themes through storytelling, through the power of ghost stories. And a lot of women did that. If you think about Edith Wharton, who wrote The Age of Innocence, she also wrote a bunch of ghost stories. Louisa May Alcott, who wrote Little Women, also wrote a bunch of supernatural stories. I think about 200 of them. So, if you think about all of these women and the power that it gave them to explore certain themes that perhaps in their everyday life, in a religious life, in a wife life, in a motherhood life, that they wouldn't be able to explore that. But this allowed them that space. And if you want to read ghost stories in that sense, not just for the superstitious elements or the shocking elements, but if you want to read it as a way of empowering women and keep empowering them, think about it. If you want to keep exploring Gaskell's Gothic tales, I highly recommend Louise the Witch and Poor Clare. Both stories are about female sort of desires, like the old nurse's story, who kind of touches a little bit about, female desire and female rage and vengeance and things that she doesn't talk about. Because in Cranford, you have relationships that are good, wholly supportive, and that's great. But about the other side of that relationship, you can explore something different, right? And that's something that Gaskell likes to play with, especially in Louise the Witch, which is one of my favorites. She talks about how women find power through telling stories, through telling superstitious stories, and how that can also affect them, but at the same time, I find it very empowering. There's a character specifically, a nurse, who tells very, very dangerous stories that affect a young woman. So if you want to continue your journey with Gaskell, I highly recommend. She was Dickens's favorite. He used to call her his Scheherazade from the Thousand and One Nights. So keep enjoying Dickens December. Thank you for letting me be here. Thank you for joining me in this little talk. If you stay this far, have a happy Christmas if you celebrate, or happy holidays, and whatever you celebrate, I hope you are surrounded with love, family, and a little bit of ghosts. Love you lots. Bye.